long before the world called them Boer Wars, long before the smoke of rifles drifted across the rolling veldt. There were only quiet hills, soft golden grasslands, and families who lived with the steady rhythm of nature. The South African highlands were a place where the wind moved gently, brushing across the tall grass the way fingers glide over the strings of a quiet instrument. Everything here seemed slow and widespreading under a sky so open, it felt as if the horizon stretched into forever. Before there were armies, there were wagons. Before there were battles, there were prayers whispered into the dry evening air. Before there were empires, there were small fires crackling under the stars. The story of the Boer Wars begins not with gunfire, but with footsteps, uncertain footsteps of people searching for a place where they could live in peace. The Boers were farmers, ordinary people. Many were descendants of Dutch settlers who had arrived on the southern tip of Africa generations earlier. Some carried French blood, some German, some from other corners of Europe. What held them together was simple. They wanted land, space, and freedom. They wanted to live under their own sky, without the strict rules of the British Empire pressing on their lives. And so they travelled. They travelled with ox wagons that creaked across dry earth. They travelled with children walking beside them, dust collecting on their small bare feet. They travelled with Bibles wrapped in cloth, with rifles slung across their hips, and with hopes tucked quietly into their hearts. History calls it the Great Trek, but to the families walking day after day across the harsh land, it simply felt like a long journey, one step at a time. Guided by faith and the promise of new beginnings, the high veld spread out before them like a golden ocean. Its grasses shimmered in the sun, bending with every whisper of wind. There were no cities here, no stone walls or paved streets, just stretches of open land and the soft shapes of distant hills. At night, the sky glittered with more stars than they could name, and the world felt so wide that even silence seemed to travel far. The Boers built small homes wherever they settled, modest houses of stone or mud brick, surrounded by cattle pens and fields of corn. Their days were filled with simple work, ploughing, tending animals, making tools, raising children. Their nights were spent under lamplight, sharing meals, telling stories, and reading aloud from worn, beloved books. Life was quiet. Life was hard, but life was theirs. For many years, the British presence remained far away. The Empire had its own concerned trade routes, coastal ports, and distant politics. But like the slow pull of a tide, British influence pushed steadily inland. And the Boers, who valued independence more than comfort, felt that pressure like a weight on their shoulders. They moved further north, further east, further into the highlands, where the land rolled like soft waves of earth and the sky looked especially large. They settled in places where there were no judges, no governors, no British laws. They created their own small republic, simple. Young governments shaped by the people who lived there. The South African Republic, the Orange Free State, names written later in history books. But at the time, they were nothing more than promises of quiet life, of freedom. But beneath the peaceful surface, changes were stirring. The African landscape was not empty. It was home to strong African kingdoms, the Zulu, the Ndebele, the Basotho, the Kosowich, with their own histories, their own leaders, their own battles for survival. The Boers' arrival, though gradual, shifted the balance of power, creating new tensions, new conflicts, new misunderstandings. Swords clashed, spears struck, wagons circled, shields broke. Treaties were written, broken, rewritten, and broken again. The land was beautiful, but it was not simple by the mid-1800s. British interest in the interior had changed dramatically. Something had been discovered, something shiny, small, and bright enough to shift the future of a continent. Gold, not just a few nuggets in riverbeds, but massive veins of it running beneath the earth, near the city that would later be known as Johannesburg. The land that once seemed barren suddenly glittered with value, and that discovery drew the British Empire's attention like a spark draws. Eyes in the dark. With gold came roads, with gold came railways, with gold came thousands of new settlers, businessmen, adventurous people who wanted wealth and saw South Africa as the new frontier of opportunity. And with gold came the British desire for control. The Boer republics, once ignored, suddenly mattered. The wealth beneath their ground mattered more. The quiet farmlands no longer looked like peaceful little nations, but like obstacles to British expansion. And so a slow tension began to grow, like a dry branch bending under weight, waiting for the moment it might snap. But the Boers were stubborn, proud, determined to hold on to the lives they had built. Their independence had been carved out through hardship, won through long journeys and conflicts, shaped by years of sacrifice. They were not eager to trade it for imperial flags and royal decrees. Behind every simple farmhouse, behind every quiet family meal, behind every child learning to read by candlelight, a silent fear began to grow. What will happen to us when the British come for what is beneath our feet? And still, the grasslands swayed gently, unaware of the storm forming over the horizon, travelers moving across the veldt. During those early years often described the land as peaceful, place where cattle grazed in wide circles, and the sound of distant voices carried on the wind. But if they listened more closely, they would hear something deeper, the low, steady murmur of change, the quiet breath of tension, the whisper of futures colliding. The British Empire was vast, powerful, and confident. It saw the Boer republics not as nations, but as pieces on a board, pieces that could be moved or taken if necessary. The Boers saw themselves as guardians of their own destiny, farmers who simply wanted to raise their families and live by their own rules. Two ways of life, two visions of freedom, two worlds inching toward each other with no room in between. Yet in the years before the wars began, no one spoke loudly of conflict. Life went on in its slow, steady way. Children still chased goats across dusty yards. Women baked bread in small stone ovens. Men rode horses across the plains to check fences or visit neighbors. Nights still glowed with lamplight and quiet stories. But beneath that softness, something was shifting. In the far-off halls of government, decisions were being made. In minds filled with sweat and dust, fortunes were rising. In the British colonies, newspapers whispered of control, expansion, and empire. In the Boer republics, families grew uneasy as laws tightened, as taxes rose, as pressures increased. The storm was gathering, but the grass still whispered gently. The sky still stretched wide. The hills still glowed gold under the sun. History often remembers wars as sudden explosions, violent, loud, unexpected. But the Boer Wars did not begin with a spark. They began with whispers, with footsteps on soft earth, with families searching for land, with empires searching for wealth. They began with quiet choices, made long before a single shot was fired. And as the last years of peace drifted across the highlands, the people living there could not yet see how deeply their lives were about to be changed. They could feel tension, yes. They could sense worry. They could hear the distant hum of politics. But no one, not even the wisest among them, could fully imagine the vast machinery of war slowly turning toward their quiet farms. Not yet for now. The storm remained behind the hills, hidden, growing, waiting, and the golden highlands breathed softly under the open sky, unaware that soon the world would come to know their name not for their beauty, but for the conflict they would. Cradle, the quiet land was about to become a battlefield. The gentle nights were about to echo with thunder, and the story of the Boer Wars was preparing to walk out of the shadows and into the fire of history. The South African veldt in the late 1800s still looked peaceful from a distance, golden, grass stretching far in every direction, dotted with slow-moving cattle and the occasional white farmhouse surrounded by wind-worn fences. But the peace was thin now, like cloth stretched too tightly. Anyone who looked closely could see the small tears forming at the edges, the shadows growing across. The veldt were not from clouds or distant hills. They were from choices, ambitions, fears, and rival visions of the future. The Boers had built their republics with the steady rhythm of farmers' hands. The British had expanded their influence with the steady rhythm of empire. Two rhythms, both strong, both proud, now beating against each other like drums that refused to fall into harmony, and the land between them felt these beats, absorbing every measure, every tremble, every whisper of tension. For years, the British Cape Colony and the Boer republics had existed in an uneasy balance. They traded goods. They shared roads. They argued about borders and grazing land, but tried, in their own ways, to avoid open fighting. Yet deep beneath the surface, resentment simmered like heat trapped beneath dry earth. It was gold that stirred the soil. It was power that kept it shaking. It was pride that made it crack in 1886. The discovery of gold on the Witwatersrand changed everything. Even people far across the ocean could feel the shift, as if someone had struck the ground with a giant hammer and set the world vibrating. The news traveled fast, faster than any wagon or horse ever had. Newspapers printed it in bold letters. Ships carried the story to England, Germany, America, and beyond. A new land of riches had been found, and thousands began to move. They came from crowded cities, from poor farmlands, from distant continents. They came to dig and sift, to mine and gamble, to search for luck in the glittering dust. They were the Uitlanders outsiders, men of many languages, many beliefs, many ambitions. Johannesburg rose almost overnight. A restless young city made of tin roofs, wooden shacks, muddy streets, and restless hearts. It was noisy, crowded, and full of energy that pulsed day and night. But outside the city, on the quiet farmlands of the Boers, an unease crept in. The Uitlanders were numerous, now too numerous. They outnumbered the Boers in their own republic, and yet they had no political rights, no vote, no voice in the government that ruled over them. Some accepted this, others resented it, and still others began whispering to the British government, urging it to intervene. The British Empire listened, not because they cared deeply about the Uitlanders' voting rights, but because gold, power, and influence shimmered behind every complaint. Meanwhile, President Paul Kruger of the South African Republic looked out at the growing number of foreign miners and felt fear. Not fear of the people themselves, but fear that his small republic, built with so much sacrifice, was now surrounded by forces that threatened its independence. Kruger was a quiet man, deeply religious, with heavy features and thoughtful eyes. He moved slowly, spoke slowly, even breathed slowly. But he understood power. He understood the fragility of small nations. And he understood that the British Empire did not retreat easily to protect his people. He tightened laws. He raised requirements for citizenship. He insisted that the Republic needed time years to absorb so many strangers. But to the British, his actions looked stubborn. To the Uitlanders, they looked unfair to the Empire. They looked like an opportunity. The tension grew thicker, like clouds gathering before a storm. Yet on the veldt, daily life continued. Boer farmers still milked their cows in the soft morning light. Children still chased chickens across yards. Women still baked bread and hung laundry in the sun. But every household, every farm, every dinner table carried the same question. What will happen to us now? The road to conflict was paved, not with sudden violence, but with slow pressure political demands, bitter arguments, failed negotiations, and growing distrust. One moment that pushed the world closer to war came in the form of a failed raid exchange, clumsy event that history would later call the Jameson Raid. In 1895, a group of British-backed adventurers attempted to invade the Boer Republic from the west, hoping to spark an uprising among the Uitlanders in Johannesburg. The plan was bold, but poorly executed. The raiders rode in with confidence, but were stopped by Boer commandos long before they reached the city. Their horses were tired. Their supplies ran low. Their message never reached the miners. The uprising never happened. The raid failed. But the trust between Britain and the Boer Republic shattered like thin glass falling onto stone. Boer leaders looked at the British and saw deceit. British leaders looked at the Boers and saw defiance. And neither side was willing to forget in the years that followed. Negotiators met in quiet rooms. Letters were written in polite tones but with sharpened meaning. Meetings were held where voices rose too quickly and ended too abruptly. The British demanded voting rights for the Boers insisted on time. The British threatened. The Boers resisted. The tension became a living thing, breathing, growing, waiting. On the veldt, soldiers trained quietly, not knowing when the first orders might come. In British halls, officials drafted demands in the Boer republics. Farmers polished their rifles and checked their horses. In Johannesburg, miners talked in loud cafes about politics, wages, and rumors of war. Children sensed worry in their parents' voices. Wives noticed the long silences of their husbands. Young men wondered whether they would soon be called to fight. And the land, a vast, patient land, waited under the growing weight of uncertainty. The British Empire began moving troops towards South Africa, sending them on long steamships from distant ports. Thousands of red-coated soldiers landed at harbors, marching through streets filled with curious eyes. Supply wagons rolled across the Cape. Telegraph wires hummed with messages of preparation. Meanwhile, Boer commandos' local militia groups gathered on farms. They practiced shooting at tin cans. They rode horses through dry grass. They held field meetings under the open sky, listening to their leaders speak of danger, duty, and God. Too many Boers. The British soldiers seemed like giants, an unstoppable force. But in the hearts of the commandos, courage rose quietly. They knew the land. They knew the hills, the rivers, the hiding places. They believed strongly that God was on their side, and they believed that freedom was worth fighting for. As the months passed, the British issued one demand after another. The Boers tried to negotiate, but felt cornered. Kruger sent telegrams asking for fairness. The British answered with firmness. By 1899, the fragile balance between them broke. The Boer government issued an ultimatum. British troops must withdraw from their borders. The British refused. The moment felt like a breath held too long, a string pulled too tight, a silence growing too loud. All the tension that had built over years now trembled on the edge of action, and then the first step was taken. Not with a shout, not with fanfare, but with a quiet, steady resolve. Boer commandos mounted their horses and rode out under the clear sky. Their rifles were strapped over their shoulders. Their hats cast small shadows over their determined eyes. They crossed borders, not with pride but with purpose, believing they were protecting their homes, not in distant British camps. Soldiers prepared their weapons, tightened their boots, and marched toward the front. They carried the weight of empire on their shoulders, trained to follow orders, ready for whatever lay ahead. Farmers who had never walked beyond their own grazing lines now rode toward distant towns, unaware of the long journey ahead. Young men who had spent their lives tending sheep now carried rifles across unfamiliar terrain, and boys barely past childhood watched their fathers prepare, knowing they would soon be old enough to follow. The road to conflict stretched before them like a long, dusty trail, a trail neither side truly wanted, but one neither side could avoid. And as the last quiet days faded across the veldt, the shadows lengthened, the sky darkened, and the world took a slow breath before the storm. Behind every farmhouse, behind every British fort, behind every wagon rolling across the earth, the land waited silent, ancient, patient. The fires of war had not yet been lit, but the kindling had been laid, and the first sparks were beginning to fall. The peaceful highlands, once filled with nothing but the whisper of golden grass, were about to echo with something far louder: the footsteps of armies, the thunder of conflict, and the long, weary heartbeat of history marching forward. War seldom begins with the loud crash that history books describe. Sometimes it begins quietly, soft footsteps on dusty ground, horses breathing in the cold dawn air, and men standing still with their rifles held against their chests. That was how the First Boer War truly unfolded, gently, cautiously, like a sunrise creeping across the edge of the veldt, bringing light and danger together. The year was 1899. The borders had been crossed. The letters of ultimatum had been exchanged. And yet, on the morning the first decisive shots were fired, the world was still calm. The veldt stretched out under a peach-colored sky. Birds stirred in the thorn trees. A thin, chilly mist clung to the dry grass, the kind that burns away quickly once the sun grows confident. And in the distance, like faint silhouettes carved from the early light, the first groups of Boer horsemen gathered on the ridges. They were quiet men, farmers, shepherds, hunters sitting tall in their saddles. Their rifles rested across their knees. Their eyes, usually soft and familiar in the comfort of home, had grown sharper now, shaped by purpose and worry. They looked out across the land with a mixture of fear, pride, and something deeper, something that felt like duty. Behind them, their horses snorted, shaking tiny clouds of steam into the cold morning air. Saddles creaked. A few whispered words drifted through the ranks, gentle reminders, hushed prayers. Small promises. No one shouted. No one rushed. This was not an army marching with drums. This was a people defending what they believed was theirs. Far on the other side, the British troops stood in more formal lines. They were disciplined, trained, and heavily armed. They came from cities, barracks, and training grounds half a world away, brought here by empire and obligation, their boots pressed neatly into the earth. Their uniforms, once crisp and perfect, were already gathering dust from the long marshes. Some of the young British soldiers had never seen a veldt before. They had never heard its quiet, endless hum. They had never seen a sunrise that stretched so wide it made them feel both small and strangely peaceful. The British commanders studied maps spread across wooden tables. The Boers studied the horizon, relying on memory rather than ink. Both sides waited for orders that would forever change the valleys resting before them. Then, as the sun began to lift itself above the hills, its first rays touching the dry grass with a warm glow, a single rifle cracked across the open land. It was not dramatic. It was not thunderous. It was simply sharper sound that broke the morning like a thin line drawn across quiet water. The birds scattered, the horses jerked, the soldiers stiffened, and the first battle, the Battle of Krapen, began. The Boers did not rush forward. They moved with quiet coordination, spreading themselves along ridges and depressions in the land, taking advantage of every curve and slope. Their rifles spoke in soft, steady rhythms, single shots, carefully aimed, like fingers tapping on a wooden door. The British soldiers returned fire with discipline, forming lines as they had been trained, their rifles rising and falling like waves. Smoke curled from the barrels, drifting upward into the brightening sky. From a distance, the fight did not look chaotic. It looked like two shadows pressing against each other, testing strength, testing resolve. The Boers were outnumbered. The British were outmaneuvered. The land decided nothing. It simply watched, ancient and unchanged. The first hours of fighting revealed something surprising to the British officers. These quiet farmers were not amateurs. They rode swiftly, ducked behind rocks with natural instinct, and aimed with the precision of men who had spent years hunting across open plains. The British rifles fired in volleys. The Boers fired in whispers. Each side believed deeply in its cause, and that belief echoed through the rising dust. As the sun climbed higher, the mist faded. Shadows shrank. The ground warmed beneath the soldiers' boots and horses' hooves. The cries of battle mixed with the steady thump of distant artillery and the sharp crack of gunfire. Then something new filled the air, the smell of gunpowder drifting across the veldt, clinging to the dry wind like a scent the land had never wanted to learn. More clashes followed across the region at Elandslaagte, at Talona Hill, at Ladysmith, where the British camp lay waiting. Surrounded by hills the Boers now occupied, war had begun gently, but it was spreading quickly. Like grass catching fire after a single spark, the British soldiers, confident in their numbers and training, soon realized that this would not be a simple campaign. The Boers knew the land the way one knows a childhood path of Rehill. Every hidden dip, every stream concealed by tall grass. They rode in small bands, moving swiftly between positions. They fired, disappeared, reappeared. Their commandos flowed across the terrain like shadows cast by clouds, never staying long enough to be trapped. Always watching, always listening. The British marched in lines. The Boers moved like wind. It became clear that the war would not be decided by strength alone. Stories carried across the land, stories of small Boer groups capturing large British supply trains, of commandos slipping through the night to strike and vanish before sunrise, of young farmers fighting with their fathers and brothers. One such story passed quietly among the night fires of the Boers. It spoke of a young boy, barely 15, who rode out with his father to scout the British lines. When his father's horse stumbled, the boy dismounted, helped his father up, and led him through the darkness while bullets cut the air around them. They returned to camp, exhausted but alive, their bond deeper and their courage unbroken. The British had stories, too. Stories of soldiers marching for hours under scorching sun, carrying heavy packs, enduring long nights, and fighting far from home. Stories of officers writing letters beneath lantern light, their words filled with longing for family and hope for peace. Stories of young men who enlisted, seeking adventure, only to find themselves staring at an enemy they barely understood in the first weeks of war. Both sides saw bravery, both sides saw fear, both sides saw loss, and beneath all of it, the land remained unchanged, open wide, patient, holding the footsteps of every rider, every soldier, every wandering soul. As the early battles unfolded, diplomacy tried one last time to take hold. Telegraph lines hummed with messages urging restraint, negotiation, compromise. But the momentum of war is like a heavy wagon rolling downhill. Once it gains speed, it becomes harder and harder to stop. The British High Command sent orders from Cape Town. More troops were called in from across the empire. Australia, Canada, India, New Zealand. Smoke rose from steamships carrying thousands of soldiers to the shores of South Africa. The Boers rallied their commandos, calling men from distant farms, leaving crops unharvested and cattle untended. Families watched their husbands, fathers, and sons ride away into the early light, unsure if they would return. The veldt no longer hummed with simple morning sounds. It now carried the echoes of marching boots, the rumble of horse hooves, and the whisper of dust stirred by the wind. Yet even in the midst of this gathering storm, there were moments of quiet humanity. A British soldier sharing water with a captured Boer teenager, a Boer farmer offering medical aid to a wounded British scout, two enemies pausing in the heat of midday to rest in the shade of the same rocky outcrop, too exhausted to fight. War changes men, but sometimes even war remembers that men are human. As October turned to November, the first phase of the war what historians call the Boer Offensive reached its peak. The Boers had seized towns, surrounded British garrisons, and captured supply routes. They moved quickly, decisively, using the land like a familiar ally, but the British Empire was vast, and it was waking up. Reinforcements arrived by the thousands. Railways expanded, lines tightened. The first shots fired at sunrise had stirred the world, and the world was now responding as night fell upon the veldt at the end of one long day of fighting. The sky glowed with deep shades of purple and blue. The stars came out quietly, as they had always done, watching the earth with their distant, patient light. Soldiers on both sides sat by low fires. Some wrote letters home, some patched torn clothing, Some whispered prayers, some simply sat, staring at the flames, wondering what the next sunrise would bring. The war had begun gently, but it was growing quickly, and soon the battles to come would shake the land far more fiercely than anyone yet imagined. For now, though, the veldt breathed under the stillness of night, holding both the fear of tomorrow and the memory of the first shots at sunrise, shots that had carried far beyond the hills, echoing into the chapters of history yet to unfold. Before the world had fully absorbed the first shocks of the war, before newspapers in London and Cape Town had finished printing their early reports, the shape of the conflict began to shift. It shifted not on the maps in officers' tents, but on the open veldt, where dust rose behind fast-moving horses and distant thunder carried the rhythm of hooves. Guerrilla war had arrived, and it reshaped the Boer Wars in a way that neither side had expected. To understand this moment, you must imagine the veldt through the eyes of those who lived upon it, not as soldiers saw it, with lines and strategies and borders, but as farmers saw it, an endless world of rolling grasslands, rocky ridges, thorn trees bending under the wind, and skies stretching farther than thought. Place where a man could ride for hours without seeing. Another soul where silence lived like a creature of its own, where the land itself became both shield and weapon. It was in this vast openness that the Boer commandos became something unique in the history of war. Fighters who moved not as a traditional army, but as riders of the landscape. They were sons of the land, children of long treks and frontier hardship, men whose skills had been sharpened by daily life, tracking, hunting, surviving, and now they carried those skills into the growing conflict. British troops marched in neat formations. Their boots struck the ground in steady patterns. Their supply wagons creaked behind them. Their officers called commands that echoed over the plains. But the Boer commandos did none of that. They rode in small groups, 20, sometimes just a handful. They moved quietly, their horses leaving only faint marks on the dry earth. They traveled light, a rifle, a bandolier of bullets, some dried meat, a tin cup, and a rolled blanket tied behind the saddle. They slept wherever the land offered shelter, beneath thorn trees, inside dry riverbeds, under starlit skies that watched silently over every wandering soul. When they attacked, it was swift. When they fled, it was silent. When they vanished, it was as if the land swallowed them whole. The British soon learned the fighting. Men who knew the veldt was like chasing shadows. The commandos appeared suddenly, fired with precision, then rode off before soldiers could mount a counterattack. Dust clouds on the horizon became warnings. The faint echo of hooves became alarm bells. The quiet at noon became a place where danger could rise at any moment. Every commando had stories passed quietly between fires, shared in murmurs beneath cold blankets, or remembered silently during long nights. These stories floated through the veldt like drifting pieces of smoke. One such story began near the Modder River, where a young Boer marksman named Willem took position behind a low cluster of rocks. He wore no uniform, only a patched coat and a wide-brimmed hat to shield his eyes from the sun. From his vantage point, he saw a long British column moving slowly below. He breathed deeply, steadying himself the way his father had taught him while hunting antelope. He fired once. A distant clatter followed. Then, before the echo faded, Willem vanished into the grass, moving low and silent, leaving nothing but dust behind. There was also the story of Umasani, an elderly Boer woman whose farm lay near a supply route. Whenever British patrols passed, she offered them tea, bread, and kindness. But hidden inside her shawl was a small coded note information from passing commandos about troop movements, quietly given to her by riders who trusted her wisdom. When the patrol left, she would slip the note to a young messenger boy, who galloped off into the dusk. And there was the story of a group of commandos who rode all night under a moonlit sky. Their silhouettes stretched across the veldt like long, dark brushstrokes. They rode without speaking, listening to the rhythm of hooves, the whisper of wind, and the faint calls of night birds. At dawn, they reached a British telegraph line and cut it quietly before disappearing again into the hills. These stories, quiet human became the heartbeat of the early guerrilla campaign. British commanders, trained in structured European warfare, struggled to understand this new kind of enemy. Their maps were precise. Their formations were disciplined. Their weapons were advanced. But none of that mattered on a land where the enemy could be everywhere and nowhere at once. A British column might march all day across open plains, seeing nothing but shimmering heat and bending grass. Then, at sunset, a few sharp rifle shots would ring out from an unseen ridge. Soldiers would scramble for cover, return fire blindly, and then find after minutes of confusion that the attackers had vanished without leaving a single trace. No footprints, no campfire remains, just silence. Frustration spread among British officers. They ordered scouts. They ordered search parties. They drafted new strategies to trap the riders. But the more they tried to tighten their grip, the more the commandos slipped through their fingers like dry sand. The British were not weak, far from it. Their numbers were vast. Their resources seemed endless. Their determination was strong. But the veldt favored those who knew its every crease and shadow to understand guerrilla warfare in the Boer Wars. You must understand the land itself. The veldt was not empty, it was alive. Wind swept through it like a restless spirit. Dust rose in swirling paths that could hide a rider's approach. The sun cast long shadows that disguised movement. Rocky outcrops provided shelter for sharpshooters. Dry riverbeds became hidden roads. Thorny bushes masked horses waiting in ambush. The commandos treated the land as a companion. The British treated it as a barrier. This difference shaped the war. When night fell, the commandos gathered in small clusters, sometimes only a dozen men. Their fires were faint just enough to warm hands and boil water. They spoke quietly. They sharpened knives, cleaned rifles, mended saddles. Some wrote letters home. Others simply watched the stars. The stars were especially bright on the veldt. They shimmered like dust scattered across black velvet. Sometimes the riders lay on their backs, staring upward, letting the night settle over their tired bodies. Some prayed, some remembered families they had left behind. Some wondered how long the war would last. The Boers did not have large camps or marching bands or official mess halls. They had tin cups, old saddles, dried meat, and the endless sky. Yet many found peace in these simple nights. Even guerrilla fighters needed moments of rest. And in those moments, humanity surfaced in gentle ways. A Boer commando offered water to a lost British scout who stumbled into their camp by accident. A British doctor treated a wounded Boer boy who had been found near a riverbank. A group of Boer riders helped a British unit bury a fallen soldier, before parting ways again, this time as enemies, earlier as men. These moments did not stop the war, but they softened it. They reminded both sides that battles are fought by people. not by faceless forces. As the months passed, the guerrilla tactics sharpened. Commandos struck supply lines, derailed trains, ambushed patrols, and captured wagons. They appeared suddenly on hilltops, firing from impossible angles. They used decoys, fast horses, and deep knowledge of the terrain. The British called them elusive as ghosts. The Boers called themselves just farmers who refused to bow. But the thunder of their hooves grew louder, and the British Empire understood that this war would not be short to defeat the commandos. The British would soon turn to harsher measures, measures that carried a deep cost, measures that still echo painfully through history. But in these early days, before scorched earth, before camps, before devastation, the commandos rode like wind across the Veldproud, determined, quiet, and swift. Dust rose behind them, thunder rolled beneath them, and the war moved into a new Chapter 1, shaped by speed, silence, and shadows stretching across the endless plains. The guerrilla riders had taken the stage, and the world watched as the land itself transformed into a living arena of courage, fear, resilience, and the long, stubborn fight for freedom. There are moments in history when war does not roar. It settles instead like a heavy mist, slow and quiet, wrapping itself around the lives of ordinary people until the weight becomes part of their breathing. As the Boer Wars unfolded, this quiet heaviness spread across the land, not on the battlefields where horses thundered and rifles cracked, but in the still spaces where families waited behind fences, far from the riders who once protected them. It began far from cruelty, though cruelty is what history often remembers. In truth, it began with frustration. The British marched for weeks across the High Veld, searching for commandos who moved like wind. They saw dust clouds, but never horses. They felt the heat, but never the enemy. And as each day passed with no progress, as each ambush left them confused, as each valley revealed nothing but silence, their strategy shifted from pursuit to pressure. They believed the farms fed the war. The commandos slept there. Their horses drank there. Their families cooked meals that kept the resistance alive. So British commanders convinced themselves that if the farms vanished, the fighters would have no strength left to continue. What followed changed the rhythm of the veldt, column by column. Soldiers rode to homesteads that had stood for generations. Quiet kitchens, creaking porches, fields shaped by years of work. These places warm with memory became targets. Barns burned. Wheat fields disappeared in curls of smoke. Livestock was taken, fences torn, wells sealed. The sky filled with the drifting ash of 1,000 stories, rising like soft grey feathers into the afternoon wind. Families stood in silence, watching their worlds collapse. Mothers held children close. Elderly men prayed under their breath. The crackle of fire made everything feel final. And when the flames sank into charred ruins, the British gathered the families gently, not wanting to leave them abandoned on the open plains. They loaded wagons, guided them down dusty roads, and took them to places the world would remember long after the final battle faded. Rows of tents, fluttered in the wind, nothing more than white cloths stretched over poles, clustered together on dry earth. These were the camps, not built with malice at first, just built too quickly, too simply, too hopefully, by people who believed they were solving a problem. Inside them came the uprooted women, carrying sacks filled with folded clothes and fragile keepsakes. Children holding tin cups and small wooden toys. Grandmothers clutching family Bibles, saved from burning floors. They arrived tired, frightened, and shivering from long journeys across the plains. The fences around them were not tall, not threatening, just woven wire meant to keep the world in order. But for people who once lived under open skies, even a simple fence felt like a closing hand. The first night was always the hardest. The wind cut through the thin canvas walls. The ground was cold and unforgiving. Babies cried. Men who had once walked proudly across their land now lay sleepless, unable to comfort their families. The sound of whispered prayers floated through the camp, soft as drifting ashdot. Yet even here, humanity bloomed. Women shared food. They lit tiny fires to warm shivering hands. They comforted strangers as though they were family. Mothers brushed the dust from their children's hair, wrapped them in blankets, and hummed lullabies that carried through the night air like small threads of hope. Morning brought routine, though routine felt strange in a place like this. There were lines for water, lines for rations, lines for medicine, though the supplies were often thin and the doctors too few. Children wandered the open spaces between tents, dragging sticks in the dirt, building tiny worlds of stones, or playing make-believe to forget where they were. Some days the wind blew fiercely, coating everything in a layer of dust. Some days the sun sat high and merciless, turning the tents into sweltering shelters. But the hardest days were those when sickness drifted quietly through the camp. Measles, dysentery, typhoid, fevers that rose slowly in the night and did not break by morning. Mothers feared each cough, each shiver. They sat beside their sick children, cooling their foreheads, praying, hoping, bargaining with fate. Doctors did all they could, moving from tent to tent with calm voices and tired eyes. But the camps had grown faster than the help available. Still, kindness echoed everywhere. A nurse giving her shawl to a freezing child, a young girl carrying water for an elderly woman, strangers holding hands during the worst nights, offering comfort without words. A British guard slipping extra bread into a child's bowl when no one was watching. Humanity flickered softly, like a lantern fighting the wind. Far from these fences, in hidden valleys and rocky ridges, the commandos continued their war with a new heaviness in their hearts. Every rider knew that somewhere behind barbed wire, his family waited in uncertainty. They rode faster, fought harder, prayed deeper. Around the campfires at night, they spoke of home with tears held tightly in their throats. Are they safe? Did they reach the camp? Will my children remember me? The questions floated into the darkness like fragile sparks. Captured fighters faced their own version of captivity in POW camps. Though better supplied than the civilian camps, they carried a different burden, the ache of helplessness. Men who had once moved freely across hills now stared at horizons they could not touch. Some carved little wooden animals, some braided rope, some played cards, but many simply sat with folded arms, counting the days by the rise and fall of the sun. Even in separation, letters became threads that stitched hearts together. Boer women wrote to their husbands in careful handwriting, assuring them they were managing, telling them to stay strong. Commandos wrote in return, promising to fight for their future and dreaming of the day they would return to rebuild their homes. British soldiers wrote, 2 letters filled with longing for distant families, trying to explain the strange sorrow of guarding women and children. Instead of facing the enemy, every letter felt like a lifeline. Time in the camps did not move in days. It moved in small moments. a pot of porridge shared between neighbors, a hymn sung softly at dusk, children tracing shapes in the dirt, while mothers watched with exhausted smiles, women gathering scraps of cloths to make makeshift dolls or warm patches for torn clothing, the small triumph of a child recovering from fever, the deep heartbreak of a life lost too soon. Slowly, resilience grew. Women created little schools under the shade of stretched blankets. They taught reading, numbers, and Bible verses. Children recited lessons aloud, their voices carrying gently across the camp. Learning became a way of remembering the world beyond the fences, a promise that their story would not end here. Night after night, as fires burned low and the sky stretched wide above, the people in the camps whispered dreams of going home. They imagined rebuilt farms, green fields, laughter returning to porches, the smell of baking bread drifting through rooms no longer scarred by fear. Outside the fences, the war roared on. Horses thundered across dry plains. Rifle shots echoed through valleys. Smoke rose from burning farms. Yet inside the camps, a quieter battle took place, the battle to endure, to believe, to keep hope alive even when the world felt stripped bare. In these slow, heavy days, the spirit of the Boers bent but did not break. Women grew stronger than they ever imagined. Children carried wisdom far beyond their years. Elderly men offered gentle words to steady young hearts. The land beyond the fences waited. The commandos fought on, and the people inside the camps held tightly to the belief that peace, though distant, would one day return, like rain to a parched field in the stillness of those long nights, when the wind whispered through the tent seams and the stars glowed with patient light. The quiet truth of their endurance became the quiet strength that would carry the war toward its final chapters. The grasslands of South Africa had seen many seasons of wandering herds and drifting clouds, but during the years of the Boer Wars, they witnessed something heavier: long marches of weary men moving through dust, heat, and uncertainty. These were not the swift guerrilla strikes of the early war. This was something slower, deeper, and shaped by exhaustion and stubborn hope. The war stretched on, and both sides felt its weight pressing into their shoulders with each passing day. Imagine the veldt at dawn, the sky still pale, touched by soft lavender and gold, the air cool enough to sting the lungs, and across that quiet earth you would see shapes emerging, columns of British soldiers in formation, and far ahead the faint silhouettes of Boer commandos scattering into the hills. The land seemed endless. The conflicts seemed endless too. The British Army, strengthened by reinforcements from across the Empire, now moved with a new determination. Their numbers grew, their supplies increased, their commanders adapted. Slowly, they learned that this war would not be won by marching in straight lines or by capturing towns. They had to follow the riders. They had to chase shadows, so they began a long campaign across the burning grasslands. One that would take them through valleys of shimmering heat, across rivers that ran dry in the summer, and over plains where the wind lifted dust into swirling ghosts. These marches were not glorious. They were not heroic in the way stories sometimes pretend. They were simply long. The soldiers woke before sunrise. They rolled up worn blankets, strapped on boots, and gathered their rifles. Breakfast was quick, often just hard biscuits and a sip of tea. The moment the sun pushed itself above the horizon, the marching began. Step after step, hour after hour, boot against earth, breath against the growing heat, Some men sang quietly to keep rhythm. Some spoke to the person beside them. Others simply lowered their heads and let their minds drift to faraway places, green fields of England, cold rivers of Scotland, warm homes in Ireland, quiet farms in Canada or Australia. Their feet walked the veldt, but their hearts walked far gentler roads as the sun climbed. The heat wrapped around them like a heavy blanket. The veldt shimmered. The air wavered. Water became precious. Lips cracked, hands trembled, and uniforms grew soaked with sweat. Horses struggled. Wagons creaked loudly under the strain. Dust coated everything: hair, eyebrows, food, blankets, even the letters tucked into shirt pockets. But still they marched, sometimes. After hours of nothing but silence and wind, the crack of a distant rifle would break the air. A warning, a reminder that the enemy they chased was always closer than they seemed. Officers shouted orders. The men spread out. They crouched, watched, waited. Sometimes the shots came from a hill they could see. Sometimes from a shadow they could not. Sometimes they found nothing at all. Then, as suddenly as it began, the quiet would return. The soldiers would stand, brush dust from their sleeves, and the march would continue. Yet the British were not the only ones wandering these burning plains. The Boer commandos, still determined to defend their land, moved across the veldt with their own kind of rhythm. They rode long distances each day, their horses kicking up swirling trails of dust behind them. They traveled light, no tents, no heavy packs, no unnecessary belongings. Just rifles, ammunition, blankets, and courage. But even they began to feel the strain. The horses grew thin. The food grew scarce. The dust stung their eyes. And the nights felt colder once their farms, once their families, once their safe places, had been taken from them. Still, they rode on. Sometimes they would look out across the plains and see the distant lines of British troops moving like a slow, determined wave. The commandos knew they could not face them head, but they could outmaneuver them. They could lure them into long marches that led nowhere. They could appear at the edge of vision, fire a few shots, and vanish again. These skirmishes were brief, like flickers of lightning before a storm truly begins. The commandos would strike quickly, then disappear into dry gullies or rocky outcroppings. The British would give chase, but the riders knew the land too well. By the time soldiers reached a place where shots were fired, the commandos were already gone, leaving only dust swirling in the late afternoon heat. Yet with each passing week, each passing month, the commandos felt the tiredness settle deeper into their bones. They missed their homes. They missed their families. They missed the sound of their own cattle, the peace of their fields, the comfort of sitting at a familiar table. Some nights, they would gather around a small fire, speaking softly so the British patrols would not hear. One would mend a torn saddle. Another would sharpen a hunting knife. Someone else would tell a quiet story from Homer about a newborn child he had not yet met, or a wife who wrote letters filled with hope, or a mother who prayed each night for the war to end. Sometimes those stories brought smiles. Sometimes they brought tears. Sometimes they brought silence, deep and heavy, back on the British side. The marshes across the grasslands brought their own mix of hardship and reflection. Many soldiers had arrived in South Africa expecting a short conflict. They thought they would be home by Christmas. Instead, they found themselves walking across endless plains with no end in sight. They watched the sun rise and set, over land that felt both beautiful and unforgiving. They slept on hard ground wrapped in thin blankets that did little to keep out the cold. They listened to wind howling across the veldt like a lonely voice calling. Out in the night, some found comfort in letters from home, some found comfort in friendship, some found comfort simply in surviving each day. Others struggled quietly with fear, sadness, and longing they could not put into words. War rarely breaks people all at once. It erodes them grain by grain, day by day, step by step on burning grasslands where the horizon feels farther than hope, but under the same sky. The commandos carried their own burdens. The scorched earth policy had reached their families. Their farms were gone. Their children slept in tents. Their wives waited behind fences. And the men rode on with hearts heavy enough to darken the brightest morning each rider carried. Memories like invisible luggage, a child's laughter, a wife's smile, a father's wisdom, a mother's gentle voice. These memories became both strength and sorrow. On some evenings, far from the marching columns of the British Army, the commandos would pause near a river thin, shallow, barely flowing in the dry season. They would drink, refill their bottles, wash dust from their faces, and let the coolness of the water calm their racing minds. Above them, the sky stretched wide, sprinkled with stars that shimmered like scattered silver dust. Night birds called from distant trees. A soft wind brushed across the tall grass, carrying stories of the land's ancient past. And for a moment, just a moment, the riders felt peaceful across the plains. The British sometimes experienced the same stillness. After a long day's march, some soldiers sat quietly watching the sky darken while kettles boiled on small fires. They listened to the soft crackle of burning wood, the gentle murmur of comrades talking about home, the sigh of horses settling down for the night. Somewhere, in the same landscape but separated by war, Boer riders were doing the same. Two groups of men so different, yet so deeply human, moving across the same land, breathing the same dusty air, dreaming of the same thing: rest, peace, home. The long marches continued, through heat, through dust, through exhaustion, through days that felt endless and nights that offered only brief mercy. But even in hardship, the spirit of those who walked and rode across the burning grasslands did not disappear. It stretched, it bent, it ached. But it did not break, for the war had entered a chapter where strength was not measured by victories, but by endurance. Not by triumphs, but by the courage to keep moving even when the horizon refused to come closer. And though neither side knew it yet, these long these days filled with heat, dust, sorrow, and stubborn resolve were slowly guiding the war toward its distant ending, shaping the hearts of all who wandered the plains across these burning grasslands. Every step, every ride, every breath carried the story forward, toward a peace that still felt out of reach, but quietly waited somewhere beyond the next ridge, beyond the next sunrise, beyond the long, aching road of war. There comes a point in a long war when battles no longer feel like separate events. Instead, they blend softly into one another, like ripples crossing the same quiet river. Days lose their edges. Nights arrive not with finality, but with gentle surrender. And the people caught in the middle begin to measure time not by victories or losses, but by moments of breath, warmth, and survival. During the later stages of the Boer Wars, life between battles became its own world, shaped by waiting, wandering, and the fragile stitching together of hope. Imagine a vast plain touched by evening light, The sun sinks low, brushing gold across the horizon, and shadows stretch long over the grass. In this quiet hour, both British soldiers and Boer commandos learned to pause, if only for a little while, and feel the softness that war could not fully steal. For the British, evenings often meant the simple peace of setting down heavy packs, unbuckling boots, and letting tired legs rest. Fires flickered to life across scattered encampments, small circles of warmth glowing under the dimming sky. The men sat close, rubbing cold hands together, boiling tea in dented kettles, and watching the smoke rise like thin ribbons that twisted into the air before fading into the night. Some spoke about home fields in Yorkshire, stone cottages in Cornwall, busy streets of London, the soft rain of Ireland. Others sat quietly, staring at the fire with faraway expressions, letting the crackle of burning wood soothe the noise inside their thoughts. Letters were unfolded, read again and again, their edges worn and creased. A line from a sister, a blessing from a mother, a joke from a friend back home. Each word felt like a small lantern glowing inside the heart. Across the plains, the Boer riders found their own form of rest between clashes. Their camps were smaller, quieter, often hidden in dry riverbeds or behind rocky hills. They gathered around low flames, speaking in soft voices, careful not to reveal their presence to nearby patrols. Their horses grazed nearby, shadows moving gently against the dim starlight. The commandos mended saddles, cleaned rifles, and shared. The little food they carried: hard biscuits, strips of dried meat, sips of coffee brewed over tiny fires. These simple meals felt comforting after long days of riding, hiding, and watching the horizon with sharp, cautious eyes. Sometimes a rider would begin humming, slow him, familiar and steady. Another would join, then another, until the quiet camp gently pulsed with harmony, low and sincere, rising like a prayer carried by the night wind. Singing did not end the war, but it softened the edges of fear. And somewhere between these two worlds, between the British camps glowing like scattered embers and the hidden commando fires burning faintly in the dark, stretched the land itself, ancient and patient, watching over men on both sides. As battles grew fewer but fiercer, the times between them began to feel suspended, almost dreamlike. The soldiers moved through these days with a mixture of exhaustion and numb acceptance. Even the birds seemed quieter. Even the wind felt slower. But life did not stop. It changed. British patrols roamed cautiously through the veldt, searching for signs, hoofprints, ashes, broken branches, anything that hinted at commandos nearby. They learned to read the land, to listen to its silences, to understand when the stillness was natural and when it hid danger. With each passing week, they grew more attuned to the mysteries of the veldt. The Boers, meanwhile, watched everything. They studied the paths soldiers used. They learned the timing of patrols, the habits of scouts, the routes of supply wagons. These observations became part of their survival. Every shadow mattered. Every sound meant something. Every movement carried a message. Between battles, letters moved quietly from hand to hand, camp to camp. A mother wrote to her son, telling him she prayed every morning. A wife described the last rain on the farm before it had been taken. A young commando wrote to his sister, apologizing for missing her birthday, promising he would come home as soon as he could. These letters, though simple, filled men with both courage and sorrow. News traveled slowly across the plains. Rumors spread faster. Someone heard that the war might be ending soon. Someone else heard it would last another year. Someone whispered that reinforcements were coming. Someone heard that the commands were running low on horses. Hope rose, fell, rose again. Like breath, British officers walked among their men, giving soft words where they could, reminding them to eat, to rest, to stay alert. Boer leaders did the same, speaking to their riders with the familiarity of comrades, rather than the authority of commanders. War made leaders out of men who had once been farmers, teachers, and travelers, sometimes between the quiet nights and the restless days. The two sides met in ways that were not written in official reports. A British doctor treated a wounded Boer boy found near a riverbank, his face pale with fever. A group of Boer women, released from a nearby camp to gather firewood, exchanged polite greetings with a British patrol watching over them. A small group of British scouts found themselves lost in thick fog and were guided back to clearer roads by a Boer farmer who wished no harm. These moments did not end the conflict, but they softened its lines, reminding everyone that war did not erase humanity. One evening, after weeks of marching and skirmishing, a British private sat on a rock overlooking a wide valley. The sun dipped low, setting the grass aglow with amber light. A commando patrol watched him quietly from the ridge opposite. Neither side raised a weapon. They simply observed each other across the distance, two silhouettes against the fading horizon. When the last sliver of sunlight slipped away, both sides turned and disappeared into the gathering dusk. Between battles, the veldt regained some of its ancient peace. Wild beast wandered through dry gullies. Antelope moved in graceful arcs across hills. The wind brushed gently through thorn trees, and the sky wide, endless, unchanging, looked down on the soldiers with patient eyes. But even in this quiet, the tension never vanished. Both sides knew another battle would come. Both sides felt the truth like a weight, resting gently on their shoulders. War still lived in every shadow, every echo, every distant gunshot. It was during these stretches of relative calm that the emotional cost of the war revealed itself. The British soldiers missed their families deeply. They longed for familiar smells, fresh rain, warm bread, wood smoke from home. Letters were read until the ink faded. Memories kept men moving when their feet felt too heavy. The commandos, in turn, carried the hidden ache of knowing their families lived behind fences. Some had received letters describing sickness in the camps. Others worried because no letter had come at all. Their faces remained firm, but their eyes carried storms, sometimes at night. A young rider would sit apart from the fire, staring up at the stars as though searching for something he had lost. Another would place a hand on his shoulder. No words needed. The silence spoke enough. In the daylight, both sides prepared again and again for the next clash. Rifles were cleaned. Horses were inspected. Ammunition counted. Boots repaired. But none of these preparations erased the lingering fatigue that settled deeper with each passing week. The war had become a long twilight, neither fully dark nor fully bright, neither ending nor beginning again. Yet, in the quiet spaces between conflicts, something else slowly formed. A recognition that the war could not continue forever. The land had grown tired. The people had grown tired. Even the wind seemed to sigh more heavily as it swept across the plains. Whispers of peace drifted between the camps like wandering dust. Officers spoke of negotiations. Farmers spoke of rebuilding. Soldiers spoke of the possibility of going home. Even those who doubted the rumors felt a tiny spark inside their hearts. a spark shaped like longing. But until peace arrived, life between battles continued soft, slow, heavy with reflection. And in these in-between days, the war revealed the truest nature of the people who lived it not. The warriors who fired rifles, but the men who shared stories around fires, the mothers who prayed behind fences, the children who waited for fathers they barely remembered, and the soldiers who carried exhaustion like a second shadow. These were the quiet chapters of the war, the chapters where humanity spoke, more loudly than gunfire, the chapters that allowed both sides to breathe, even briefly, under the wide, forgiving sky. For in every long conflict, there are moments when the world stops fighting just long enough to remember why it wishes for peace at all. And in the Boer Wars, these moments, soft, fleeting, deeply human, became the heartbeat of the land itself. As the long war stretched across the plains, the world beneath the vast South African sky began to soften in unexpected ways. The thunder of hooves and the sharp cry of rifles had not vanished entirely, but they drifted farther apart now, like distant storms waiting to decide whether they should return or fade forever. Between these quiet pauses, a delicate shift began, subtle at first, like the faint rustle of wind through tall grass. It was the beginning of negotiations, whispered on both sides. Long before any words were spoken aloud, war often reaches a point where even the strongest hearts grow tired. Not broken, not defeated, just tired. Tired of dust, tired of loss, tired of the long echoes of gunfire rolling through valleys at dawn. Tired of empty seats at family tables, tired of letters heavy with worry. Tired of staring at horizons that promise home but never bring it closer. That tiredness settled into the war-like evening, light settling into the land. And slowly, gently, people began to wonder if there might be a way to end the ache. Imagine a cold, quiet morning on the veldt. Mist lies low over the ground, curling around rocks and grass, as though the earth is exhaling after many restless nights. A lone British rider moves across the plain, carrying a white cloth tied to his rifle. His horse walks slowly, hooves pressing softly into the damp soil. Across the distance, a few Boer scouts spot him, but instead of lifting their rifles, they watch carefully, aware that such a sight means something has shifted. This rider might not be delivering peace. Not yet, but he is delivering a message, a request, a proposal, a possibility. On some days, it was the British who sent word. On other days, the Boers, a scrap of paper, a summoned meeting, a simple question. Is there room yet for talking? No one knew the answer at first. The war had stretched too long and too painfully for trust to grow easily. But still, the messages continued, floating like thin threads between two weary sides. These threads grew slowly, woven by shared exhaustion, shared loss, and shared hope that perhaps the land might soon return to its quiet, natural rhythm. British camps began to hear whispers that the commanders were willing to meet. Boer riders began to hear whispers that their leaders were considering negotiations. The news did not travel like a shout. It drifted softly, carried by the same wind that brushed gently through the dry grasslands. In the evenings, soldiers gathered around their fires, wondering what it might mean. Some felt relief blooming in their chests, warm and cautious. Others felt doubt. Peace sounded beautiful, but also fragile, like something that could crumble if touched too quickly. On the Boer side, the commandos discussed the matter in hushed circles, their faces lit by flickers of firelight. Many of them longed deeply for home. They longed for their farms, their families, their beds, their old familiar days. But the pride in their hearts made them wary. They had fought so fiercely, endured so much could. They lay down their rifles without betraying their cause. No answer came easily. The leaders, too, felt the weight of these questions. They rode long distances across the plains to attend secret meetings held in quiet farmhouses still standing after months of burning. Inside these dim rooms, lit by oil lamps and smelling of dust and old wood, men sat facing one another, British officers in red and khaki, Boer generals in worn coats and wide-brimmed hats. Words mattered here. So did silences. Sometimes the discussions lasted only minutes. Sometimes they stretched for hours. The men spoke slowly, cautiously, tasting each sentence before letting it leave their lips. Outside, horses waited patiently beneath moonlit skies, and guards on both sides stood watch, with hands resting gently on their rifles, not fully trusting, not fully fearing, just waiting for a sign that the world might change. Back in the camps, the people felt the shift most deeply. Women with tired eyes and worn hands whispered to one another as they stood in line for water. Old men nodded quietly, their hearts heavy with memories of earlier, simpler days. Children tugged at their mothers' skirts, asking if they could go home soon, if their fathers would return, if the fences would ever open. Those questions, soft, innocent, became part of the air itself. In British camps, soldiers noticed their officers holding more meetings than usual. They saw maps spread across tables with new circles drawn not around battlefields, but around places where leaders might meet. They sensed a change, though none dared speak it too loudly. And on the veldt, the land seemed to lean toward peace too. The sunsets stretched warmer across the horizon. The mornings felt a little softer. The animals returned slowly to places they had avoided. Even the wind carried fewer echoes of distant gunfire. Yet, peace never comes simply. Negotiations brought disagreements, frustrations, hours of sitting across from one another, trying to shape a future from pieces of a shattered present. Sometimes voices rose. Sometimes men walked out in anger or sorrow. Sometimes entire days passed without progress, but they always came back, because the war itself pushed them toward the table. Like an exhausted elder urging quarreling children to finally speak to each other. Both sides had lost too much to continue without end. Both sides had gained too little to claim a clear victory. Both sides felt the land growing tired. Beneath their feet, there were moments during these negotiations when small gestures carried enormous meaning. A British officer pouring tea for a Boer general. A Boer leader helping translate a phrase so both sides could understand. A shared silence when someone mentioned the suffering of families in the camps. These soft moments built quiet bridges, and as these bridges formed, something rare happened. British and Boer negotiators began to see each other as men, not enemies. They saw exhaustion in each other's eyes. They saw grief. They saw longing for home. They recognized that war had taken pieces from both sides that could never be returned. Outside these rooms, both armies felt the shift. British soldiers marched. With less urgency, Boer commandos watched the horizon with more hope. Families in camps prayed more fervently. Even the dust seemed to settle a little slower. The world felt like it was holding its breath. And still, the negotiations stretched on. Every detail mattered. Land rights, political rights, livestock, language, governance, the future of children who had grown thin in the camps. the future of men who had fought across these plains with pride and desperation. It was not easy. Peace never is. But it grew gradually, like dawn rising slowly after a long, cold night. For both sides, the idea of laying down arms felt both terrifying and tender. It meant leaving behind the identity war had forced on them. It meant embracing a future unknown. It meant trusting people who had burned their farms or chased them across the veldt. It meant recognizing pain on both sides of the conflict. And yet, the longer the negotiations continued, the more the land seemed ready for quiet again. The fruit trees, those that had survived, began to bud. The rivers swelled after soft rain. The grass, once scorched and flattened, stood taller. The skies held fewer trails of smoke. The camps grew restless with hope. The patrols grew slower, more cautious. Even the moonlit nights seemed gentler, as if nature itself wished to guide the weary world toward rest. It was during one such night, under a sky thick with stars, that a British soldier wrote in his diary, "It feels as though the land is whispering to us, telling us the time has come, telling us to go home." And far away, in a hidden riverbed where Boer commandos camped, a rider whispered to his comrades, "I think this chapter is ending. I can feel it." Negotiations were not complete, yet signatures had not been placed on paper. No treaty had been sealed, but the hearts of men were changing. The land was changing. The wind was changing. Peace was no longer a dream. It was a gentle presence, drawing nearer with each quiet conversation, each shared breath, each step toward understanding. And though no one knew what the final agreement would look like, they understood one thing clearly. The war was slowly folding itself into memory, and the world was preparing to rest. The last stage of a long war rarely arrives with loud celebration. Instead, it drifts in quietly, like a change in weather that people notice, not through sudden thunder, but through the way the air softens. That was how peace approached the Boer Wars, a gentle, hesitant, trembling step after years of dust, fire, and aching hearts. In the weeks leading up to the final treaty, the land seemed to hold its breath. The wind blew slower. The sunsets stretched longer. Even the birds appeared to move more softly across the sky. It was as though nature itself understood that a chapter was nearing its end, and it wished to honor the moment with quiet reverence. British soldiers marched less sharply now. Their boots still pressed into the earth, but their steps carried a different weight. The urgency that once pushed them across the plains had softened, replaced by an unspoken awareness that the end was finally within reach. Letters from officers carried hints of cautious hope. Mess halls buzzed with murmured predictions. Some soldiers smiled more easily. Others dared not believe the whispers yet. On the Boer side, the commandos rode with hearts full of mixed emotions. They had fought fiercely, endured hunger, survived ambushes, and watched their families suffer behind fences. The war had carved itself deeply into their spirits. Yet even the most battle-hardened riders felt something shifting in the air. Each time they sat around a small campfire under the wide night sky, embers rising like tiny stars, they wondered if the war that had taken so much was ready to finally release its grip. Negotiators from both sides traveled to a quiet place, far from the smoke of battlefields. They entered rooms with heavy hearts but determined minds. And inside these rooms, the final steps toward peace began. The talks stretched for days, sometimes for nights. The men leaned over tables scattered with papers, maps, and ink-stained documents. Their voices stayed calm, but carried years of exhaustion. They spoke of land rights, language, prisoners, rebuilding, governance, and the fragile dreams of families waiting in camps. It was not easy. Every sentence carried a memory of loss. Every agreement carried a shadow of compromise. Every signature carried the weight of thousands of lives. But still, the talks continued, and while these discussions unfolded behind closed doors, the world outside waited. In the British camps, soldiers gathered around evening fires, wondering aloud what the future might hold. Some pictured marching back into familiar ports under grey skies. Others imagined reuniting with loved ones who had waited through long months of silence. A few worried what would become of the land they had grown strangely attached to, a land harsh yet beautiful, a land that had tested them in ways they never expected. In the Boer camps, hope and fear intertwined like threads woven by trembling hands. Women whispered prayers. Children asked again and again if they would go home soon. Elderly men stared at the distant horizon, imagining the shape of their farms, wondering whether any part of their old life still stood. The riders, those silent shadows of the veldt, felt the change. They moved with a slower rhythm, as if saving their strength for the final moments. Around their fires, they spoke of their families, their hopes, their uncertainties. Some worried about surrendering weapons that had become extensions of their hands. Others longed simply to step through the door of their home again. No matter what home looked like now, as the negotiations neared their conclusion, a calmness rolled across the land. British patrols grew fewer. Boer ambushes grew rarer. Even the sound of gunfire, once constant enough to echo through memory, faded into the distance. Then came the day that would be remembered not for its noise, but for its quiet. The treaty, carefully written, carefully read, carefully debated, was ready, in a solemn room with open windows that let the soft wind pass through. Representatives from both sides sat around a long wooden table. Outside, horses stood still. Guards waited in silence. The world felt suspended. One by one, the leaders lifted their pens. Their hands trembled, not from weakness, but from the enormity of the moment. For years, they had fought, fled, burned, ridden, marched, hoped, and mourned. Now, with a few strokes of ink, they would place a final stone at the edge of this long and painful road, and finally, the signatures were placed. There was no applause, no cheering, no shouts of victory, only quiet breaths released like long-held prayers. A chapter that had shaped thousands of lives had closed. Word of the treaty spread across the plains like a warm breeze after a bitter winter. British camps erupted, not with noise, but with relief soldiers embracing, shaking hands, or simply closing their eyes and letting exhaustion melt into the earth. Commanders gave soft speeches. Chaplains led prayers of gratitude. Men wrote letters home, filled with hope instead of fear. For the Boer commandos, the news reached them on horseback. Messengers rode across hills and valleys, calling out the end of the war. Some riders sat down on the grass, stunned. Others bowed their heads in silence. A few cried openly, not from sorrow or defeat, but from the overwhelming release of a burden carried too long in the civilian camps. The women heard the news first through whispers, then through official announcements. Some fell to their knees in gratitude. Others hugged their children tightly, tears falling into young hair. Families prayed together. Children laughed without knowing why. only sensing that joy had returned to the world. The land, too, seemed to breathe again. The veldt swayed gently in the wind, as if relieved. The rivers shimmered. The sky brightened with a strange, new softness. Peace had arrived not as a triumph of one side over another, but as a bomb laid gently over wounds that ran deep. The war would forever leave. Marks, homes had been lost, lives had been taken, hearts had been changed, but now, at last, the silence following the treaty carried a promise that the land would heal, that families would rebuild, that the future would rise slowly, tenderly, like dawn after a long night. And even though the war had ended, its final echoes would drift quietly through the plains, whispering stories for generations to come. Long after the smoke cleared from the battlefields, long after the treaty was signed and the last rifles were set aside, the Boer Wars did not truly end. Wars rarely end on the day the ink dries. They continue softly woven into memories, carried in stories, and felt in the quiet moments when the world grows still enough to remember. The Boer Wars became one such story, lingering like a gentle echo across the wide South African plains, shaping the hearts of those who lived through it and the generations that followed. In the first months after peace, the land felt strangely new. The grass swayed differently, no longer brushed aside by marching feet or galloping hooves. Rivers flowed quietly, unhurried by soldiers seeking water. Birds returned to branches where scouts once perched. It was as if the veldt had been holding its breath for years and could now finally exhale. Men began to return home. Their clothing was worn. Their faces were tired. Their horses thin, but their spirits moved with a quiet determination, part sorrow, part relief, part wonder at what they would find. The roads leading back to farms were lined with memories. A broken fence here, a burned barn there, a familiar hill rising in the distance. And as each rider or soldier approached his home, his heart beat harder, faster, almost painfully. Would his house still stand? Would his family be alive? Would the land welcome him back, or feel like a stranger? Some homes waited, faithfully, walls cracked but standing, doors hanging crooked but still clinging to hinges. Other homes had vanished completely, replaced by empty patches of earth scattered with ashes and charred wood. For those who found nothing left, the silence was heavy. It clung to their chests as they sat on the bare ground and sifted through ashes that once held their laughter. Yet even in this sorrow, people began to rebuild. They lifted fallen beams. They cleared debris. They planted seeds. They patched roofs with whatever materials they could find. The rebuilding was slow, sometimes painfully slow, but it was steady. Families leaned on one another. Neighbors shared tools, food, and comfort. Elderly men guided younger hands. Women organized the work of each day, shaping tasks into rhythms that gave life meaning again. Children wandered the ruins of old homesteads, listening to adults speak softly about the past, learning stories that would one day become their own. They asked questions with innocent curiosity. Why did the soldiers come? Why did we leave? When will everything grow again? The answers were gentle, shaped with care, wrapped in love to protect young hearts. Far away, British soldiers boarded ships to return home. Many left with mixed feelings, relief at leaving the hardships behind, sadness for the friends they had lost, and a strange affection for the land that had tested them. As their ships pulled away from the shores of South Africa, they leaned over the rails, watching the coastline fade into the horizon like a long, unfinished dream. They carried stories too. Stories they would tell their families in quiet kitchens or near warm hearths. Stories about endless plains, bright stars, hidden rivers, and nights when they felt both fear and awe. These memories seeped into British history as softly as they seeped into the land they left behind. The Boer families, returning from the camps, faced a different kind of war, the war of rebuilding their hearts. The months inside the tents had changed them. Mothers had grown stronger. Children had grown wiser. Grandparents carried grief that settled into the lines of their faces. But they stepped forward with courage, one day at a time, shaping new beginnings out of broken pieces. There were reunions that warmed the world fathers, kneeling to embrace children who had grown taller, husbands lifting wives into trembling arms, grandparents crying as they held newborns they had only heard about in letters. These moments were soft and shining, like sunlight breaking through clouds after a storm. But there were also reunions that never came. Empty chairs, quiet graves, names spoken with trembling voices. The war had taken many, and their absence echoed across dinner tables, across quiet evenings, across the hearts of those who loved them. Even the land held scars. Burned patches lingered for years. Rusted metal lay half buried near old battle sites. Tree trunks bore marks where bullets had struck. Rivers still carried faint whispers of fear where soldiers once crossed with trembling hands. But time, as always, began its gentle work. Grass grew again. Birds nested in new branches. The winds softened. The land healed slowly, patiently. And the people healed too. Farmers rebuilt with stronger foundations than before. Children grew into adults who carried both the stories and the strength of their ancestors. Women who had survived the camps wove resilience into their families, teaching future generations about courage, hope, and the quiet power of endurance. In small towns and on isolated farms, old men gathered round tables and spoke of the war with voices touched by memory, neither bitter nor triumphant, simply honest. They described the long marches, the cold nights, the letters that kept them alive, the friends they lost, and the pride they felt in protecting their land. British veterans did the same in their own countries. They talked softly about South Africa, the vast skies, the sharp thorns, the sudden storms, and the fierce, determined riders who defended their homes with passion few had ever seen. Some never forgot the land. Some returned years later, seeking closure or peace. The Boer Wars became more than battles on pages of history. They became human stories, stories of endurance, sorrow, courage, and healing. Stories told at family gatherings, around campfires, inside quiet houses wrapped in winter winds. These stories passed from parents to children, from children to grandchildren. They shaped identities, influenced politics, and molded the culture of a nation still young and growing. The echoes of the war moved through time like soft waves lapping gently against a shore. Never overwhelming, but always present. The land itself never forgot. Every sunrise over the veldt carried hints of old memories, riders galloping through morning mist, soldiers standing watch beneath blazing heat, mothers whispering prayers in crowded tents, children tracing shapes in dusty ground. And every sunset washed the plains in golden light that felt like forgiveness. Today, those plains remain wide and open, touched by wind and filled with quiet strength. Travelers who walk through them might feel something they cannot name: a softness, a weight, a whisper of old stories carried through the grass. It is the memory of those who lived, fought, waited, and hoped there, the memory of lives changed forever, the memory of a war that ended not only with ink, but with healing. And if you stand still long enough, with your face turned toward the horizon, you may hear those echoes, gentle, distant, and wise, reminding you that even the harshest chapters eventually soften, even the deepest wounds eventually close, and even the longest wars eventually fall silent under the tender hand of time.